Hello, and thank you for joining me. In this lesson, we finish our study of the discipleship teachings of Jesus as recorded in Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35. We'll be picking up our study today in Luke chapter 14 and verse 34. You recall that Jesus was being followed by large crowds. They assumed themselves to be part of his movement, part of the Jesus movement. I think they assumed themselves to have been disciples of the Lord, yet at best, as we've seen, most of them were superficial followers. They neither understood the Lord's spiritual mission, nor do I think they were really interested in things of a spiritual nature. They were uninformed about the subject of true discipleship. And so, as we've studied, Jesus turned to them and he clarified his terms of discipleship service. And let's not lose sight of the fact that Jesus set the bar high. As we've seen, obviously, discipleship is something that a believer does not just stumble into. A child of God does not just wake up one day and say, well, I think I'm going to be a disciple. Obviously, there's more to that. Jesus taught that discipleship involves a crisis or crises of decision. Terminology I keep using throughout this study is that of the need for an informed decision. We're talking about a decision made in the cool of the day as one has before him or herself the facts and calmly and prayerfully considers them and makes not an emotional decision but a decision based upon having reached a valuable conclusion about the worth of serving the Lord and having a desire to make the commitment to honor Him. When I speak of crisis, I'm talking about hard decisions, mature decisions that are involved in becoming a disciple of Jesus who will stay the course after having once started, after having once begun the course. Two things produce this crisis of choice. What are they? First of all, is the call of the Lord to an individual believer. Now, remember, I'm stressing this as we study. Discipleship is an individual thing, it is a personal thing. So, the call of the Lord to an individual believer to make him the Lord of one's life. We understand that this call of which I'm referencing it's not an audible call. It is rather an awareness that the Lord brings to the mind, to the heart of his child. This awareness is just simply, I know that the Lord would have me to make a commitment of my life to follow him. We can call it conviction as well, if you like. Okay, so discipleship is personal. There is a call involved, and then there are those personal and independent decisions concerning priorities, which the Lord demands one make. These decisions are not options. And we understand, as I said, one does not just stumble into discipleship service. Jesus taught that one who would become his follower, one who would become his disciple, and who would stay the course must settle his or her relationship priorities. Talking about priorities relative to the Lord on one hand, as opposed to closest earthly relations. One must settle the matters of his or her love and loyalties. One must make his love or her love and loyalty to Jesus supremely above that of closest earthly relationships. So that if a conflict ever arises, and they do, if a conflict or when a conflict arises between the desires, even the needs of loved ones, and you have that on one hand, and then on the other hand, this conflict between that and the plan of Jesus, the will of God for one's life, the issue is really settled and the decision is made to remain loyal to Jesus, to love him and obey him even above others, and to follow his will even when others don't understand. All right, so this issue of settling love and loyalty to the Lord And let me add that the Lord understood something about us. He understood that a disciple is most vulnerable, probably more vulnerable than anywhere else. A disciple is most vulnerable in the area of his or her closest earthly relations. So, in other words, uh, our loved ones, our loved ones can tug at and challenge our commitment to the Lord unlike any others. All right, so we understand then this is what Jesus said. You must settle this issue of relationship priorities. Your love and loyalty to me you must make it supremely above your love and loyalty for to and for your closest earthly relations. And remember, before we move on, that though our close relations may not always understand our commitment to the Lord Jesus Christ, we love our loved ones most when we put Jesus first. Now I realize there are some issues, there are some difficulties at times with this because we want to please our loved ones, right? But when it comes down to a matter of is it going to be Jesus or is it going to be my loved ones, the issue is settled, and the disciple has determined that I will follow Jesus wherever he leads me. The Lord also taught the need to make an informed decision to carry one's cross and to deny one's self, him or herself. In other words, talking about this renunciation of one's right to be his or her own person. I don't know about you, but I kind of I'm pretty good at trying to be my own man. And when it comes to who is the boss of my life, oftentimes Jeff is the boss and not Jesus. I have discovered that Jeff does not make a very good boss of his life. However, Jeff is thick-headed and he continues trying to be the boss of his life, and he gets himself in all kinds of trouble. And you can probably relate to this because I'm thinking that you probably struggle with the same issues that I do. So to renounce one's right to be his or her own person, and this is just to put the Lord in charge of our lives and commit to obey him even when we don't understand what he's doing in our lives and the way he is leading us. I like to call this part of it anyway, involves the dethronement of our human reasoning and logic. In our last lesson, we looked at the Lord's teaching about the need to count the cost of discipleship, and this is about the need to answer the question of one's willingness to go all in, to commit all of one's self and all of one's resources to his discipleship service, to his service of the Lord. You recall that Jesus emphasized the need for thoughtful and prayerful deliberation, and his primary concern is that one not start down a course that he or she is not prepared to do whatever it takes to finish. We call this, or you've heard it referred to as a decision to go all in, to put all your chips in. Okay, so that's what this is about. And so one who is uninformed or unprepared or uncommitted will invariably do one of two things: either quit the course, or probably what many more people do is somehow they compromise on discipleship. And it's interesting because what ends up happening, one ends up trying to serve two masters, trying to juggle Jesus with family, or whatever, making a living, or whatever may get in the way. And so you remember what the Lord taught about trying to serve two masters. Very, very clarifying teaching. He said, no man, no woman can serve two masters. Somebody's going to be number one and somebody's going to be second. So we understand then this need to settle some issues. We ended last lesson by looking at the necessity of one who would follow the Lord and keep following, the necessity of giving up all of one's own possessions. What's this have to do? This has to do with a disciple's attitude towards his or her belongings or stuff or things, if you want to call it that, one must not be possessed by his or her possessions. In other words, this is making a decision that I'm not going to base my level of commitment and my obedience to the Lord on the basis of the impact my commitment and obedience and loyalty will have on my being able to keep and control my things. Should following the Lord require me to walk away from everything? Look, I've determined in my mind, I've settled it, that if I understand this is what the Lord wants, I am going to do it. I understand that the Lord gave me everything I have in the first place, and if He asks me to walk away from it, if I need it, if I need more, He can give it back to me. So ultimately, we're coming down to just this idea of relying on the Lord to take care of me, to do me right, to never lead me in a bad direction. Talked about the concept of spiritual accounting. This is weighing out and comparing the value of discipleship service, following Jesus closely, as related to things, and concluding that the benefits of obedience, the benefit of my life being pleasing to the Lord Jesus Christ, these things are of incomparably greater value than things like position and possession. So, some really good teaching, but at the same time, it's hard. Not that it's complicated, but it challenges us, doesn't it? And again, as I've said in these studies, what these teachings force us to do is they force us to walk up and view honestly our own discipleship commitment, our own level of commitment to the Lord. And I don't know about you, but in my life, I have to walk up to these things, and I find that I don't look so good, and I don't measure up so well most of the time. But as I said when we began these particular studies, one of the great benefits of seeing myself and having to walk up to the Lord's discipleship specifications and honestly view myself is that they help me to understand my need for forgiveness, because I look and I say, Lord, I don't measure up. I fall short. There are times that I will yield my life to you, but then before you know it, Lord, I take my life back from you. All right, and so we need forgiveness. We need restoration, and these teachings also help us understand our constant need for grace. Because face it, we're talking about Jesus taught a level of commitment that you and I cannot make on our own in our own strength. We need God's help, and we need grace, His grace, to make this level of commitment for which He calls. So these teachings are really good for God's children, even though they are somewhat uncomfortable for us. But that's a good thing. I think that we need to be made uncomfortable sometimes. Okay, today we come to the Lord's teachings of Luke chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, and we're going to be looking at some metaphorical language Jesus used, the metaphor of salt that has become tasteless. Here are these verses. Let me read them to you. Therefore, this is Jesus speaking, therefore, salt is good. But if even salt has become tasteless, in other words, if salt has lost its inherent quality of saltiness, if salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? In other words, if salt has lost its quality of saltiness, how do you make it salty again? And the obvious question that is involved here is you can't do it. Okay, continuing verse 35, this tasteless salt, it is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, the Lord was still dealing with the subject of discipleship. What we need to understand is that salt can lose its quality of saltiness and become tasteless. the desalted or the denatured crystals, if you will, that cannot be made salty again. In the time in which the Lord spoke, denatured salt became of limited use and the crystals were thrown out in the roadway, all right? Thrown into the walkways and the roads. So what's this about? In the New Testament, salt is a metaphor for Christian influence and effectiveness. Now, you might recall the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaching his disciples, and he said to them, "You are." This is a statement of our purpose for being here. Many children of God, they have no clue why we are here in the world. Jesus helps us with that. He said, "You are the salt of the earth," meaning that I put you here that you might have an influence, a Christian influence, a positive influence on those with whom you work, with whom you play, with whom you go to school. So we're here to make a difference. But salt is in the New Testament, it's a metaphor for Christian influence and effectiveness. So here's what's going on. Believers who make a public statement of commitment to follow the Lord as a disciple, but who don't follow through obediently, they can lose their Christian influence and become irrelevant and ineffective. This usually involves those who know the Christian best and who can view his or her life on a consistent basis. And let me just throw something in here. Churches, God's people get hung up sometimes on this matter of sending missionaries out somewhere. And so a missionary gets sent out somewhere that the people don't know him and he doesn't know the people. And believe me, I'm not against mission work. Mission work is a biblical concept, but I do want to say that sending a missionary somewhere is not a substitute for a Christian living his or her own committed Christian life. And let's understand as well, every child of God has a mission field. Every Christian has a mission field. You say, well, what is our mission field? Our mission field consists of those who know us, consists of those within our sphere of influence, consists of those with whom we work, with whom we play, with whom we go to school, those in our own household. Now, what's the deal here? These are the people who know us as we really are. My wife, wonderful woman, she knows me as I really am. For example, I go to church, I'm a pastor. I put on my tie and my jacket and I try to clean up some and present myself as well as I can. All right. And so I will do this and I will preach the word of God. And I really enjoy doing that. But you know what? Sometimes, let me be honest. Sometimes when I get up and I'm in church, I'm assembled with my church and I'm teaching his word, sometimes I'm a hypocrite. I'm not right in my heart with the Lord. And so my preaching is a duty, is something that I'm required to do. I think you understand what I'm talking about. So, I get up and I do these things, and then I go home, and when, for example, only my wife sees, then I don't act like I do at church. All right. So what am I saying? Our mission field. We each have a mission field. It's in our own home. It's among those that we're around who can see us on a consistent basis. But you already know where I'm going with this. The hardest mission field is among those who know us best and who see us consistently. How is that? Because that's when people see who we really are. This is one of the things that Jesus taught. I don't have time to go into it right now, but we sometimes focus way too much on what we are to do as Christians. Jesus, if you'll study his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, what Jesus emphasized there was not so much what Christians do, but he's interested in what we are. And you understand what we are in our hearts and our inner man, that is what dictates what we do and how we live in our lives. But to get back to the point, um, it's easy to send somebody off somewhere else, or we could even say it's easy to go knocking on doors or handing out tracts to people who don't know us. But if you want to do that, that's fine. But we must not neglect our own sphere of influence, our own personal mission field. And indeed, that is the hardest one, because it requires commitment to the Lord on our part, a commitment, a daily commitment of the way that we live our lives. All right, so in some cases, a believer can lose his or her Christian influence and testimony and do so irremediably. In other words, you lose it and you can't get it back. Now, this doesn't mean that the Lord can't still use someone who has experienced this loss of influence and testimony, but it does mean that where some people are concerned, a child of God can lose his or her influence and can't get it back with those particular people. They just kind of write him off or write her off as a hypocrite and things like that. We understand that God forgives us and he forgets our disobedience when we confess it. This is 1 John 1:9. However, people don't always forget. I just keep being reminded of that man that Jesus talked about who started to build a tower. He laid the foundation, but he didn't have the internal resources, the dedication to finish out. And so that unfinished foundation caused that man to be a laughing stock to all people who saw him. In other words, they didn't take him seriously. He became irrelevant. Not many believers are willing to sell their Christian influence. If I were to ask you, could I buy from you your Christian influence for $1 million? You would probably say, no, you cannot buy it. It is not for sale. Most Christians will not sell their Christian influence. However, it is possible for one to give away his or her Christian influence by living in a way that does not correspond to his or her public profession. So what we have in these last two verses in this lesson today, these words of the Lord, it's a warning, isn't it? Jesus said, don't start down a course publicly. Don't start down this discipleship course if you're not prepared to follow through on it, to go all in, and to do whatever it takes to get the job done and to go all the way. I'll finish this lesson with these words, is that we all fall short. We'll start down the course of following the Lord obediently. We may go along, do really well, and then things come up. We get distracted. We cease following the Lord. All right, that can be a very damaging thing. However, what I want to say today to you is that we can never reach a point that God won't forgive us when we ask Him and restore us to service. So, though we do falter and though we can lose our influence where some are concerned, while we're still here, we can still be used by the Lord. And God is about forgiveness. He is about second and third and fourth and multiple chances. And that's good news to me because I need it, and I know it's good news to you because you need it too. So I hope you've enjoyed these teachings. Now, let me just tell you that the next series of lessons, we'll probably have three more lessons on this subject of Christian discipleship. We're going to go over to Mark chapter 8, and we're going to look at some verses that tend to be, historically, they have tended to be misunderstood and misapplied, talking about, profit and loss. Whoever will save his life will lose it, and whoever will lose his life will save it. So some wonderful discipleship teachings there. That's where we'll be going next. Thank you for tuning in, for joining me in this lesson. And remember, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel. If you like a lesson, push the thumbs up button and like it. And if you have any questions, if you'd like to discuss anything that I have delivered, I've presented in these lessons. You probably have my email address, or you know somebody who does, or you have my phone number. Feel free to call or contact me, and man, I would love to discuss things with you. So thank you again for joining me. The Lord bless you, and whether it's evening or day or morning or whatever, I wish the Lord's blessings upon you, and you have a good evening or a good day. Thank you.